Hey guys, these notes are real short, but I just wanted to touch on a few of the things so you really understand how the Vietnam War ended and have a clear perspective of that. So let's talk through it real quickly. um, Nixon's like famous kind of saying when he was running for election in 1968 was he has a secret plan to get us out of the war. So what was his secret plan? It was something called Vietnamization. It's not real fancy. It's nothing real, hey, we got the atomic bomb or anything like that to get us out of the war. It was basically, I'm going to start pulling American troops out and replacing them with South Vietnamese. We will train the South Vietnamese and we're going to start handing over the fighting to them. Um, the part of Vietnamization that he didn't tell the American people is as we pull more soldiers out, we're going to increase bombing. So to a certain extent, it um, got us out of the war. Less people were being killed, maybe on the ground, but we continued to be in the war at a high rate. All right. This slide, what you're seeing is the number of Americans that were in Vietnam by the year. And you can see like the high water mark is that 1968 year. We're at like over 500,000 troops. And you can see Nixon gets elected in 68 and slowly that number starts going down. Really, like, doesn't start going down in large numbers until like 1971, 1972. 72 is an election year. So Nixon's really hoping to get the troops down by that year so that he can tell the American people, see, I told you I'd get us out of Vietnam. Um, the thing that Nixon does and tries to not allow the American people to know is in 1970, he began secretly ordering the bombing of Cambodia. So Vietnam is there in the orange, Cambodia is the country in the yellow. He starts bombing that. He says later on, he says to clear out the communist camps. Plus, the supply route for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong was this Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's the dotted line. And you can see what they would do. They would cut through Laos, they would cut through Cambodia, and then they would strike in South Vietnam and get supplies in there. So he was hoping bombing Cambodia would help. Later on, he also starts bombing Laos, but he does not tell the American people this. One thing that American soldiers said was really frustrating was they could fight in Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong knew they could literally like go across the line from Vietnam into Cambodia and almost like wave at the American soldiers. We did not give our soldiers permission to like fire into Cambodia and chase them into Cambodia. Now, some of that did happen, we know, but they didn't have permission to do that. So Nixon secretly starts bombing Cambodia. And a whole slew of protests come out of that bombing in Cambodia once it comes out. In 1972, it's an election year. Nixon wants to get reelected. Days before the election, Nixon announces to the country, peace is at hand. And he believed that if he told the American people that we're almost at a peace agreement, um, that would just help his chances of getting reelected. But the peace settlement was not final. In fact, after he did get reelected in 1972, he ends up having to bomb North Vietnam again to try to convince them to meet us at the peace table again. Um, just in general, that's a picture of a B 52 dropping bombs in Vietnam. We dropped more bombs in North Vietnam than we dropped in the entire World War II, which is pretty crazy. Um, So that's what we're covering on this slide. In January of 1960 or 1973, they finally do draw up a peace agreement. Here's what was said on the peace agreement: that the U.S. would withdraw all troops within 60 days, that all prisoners of war from both sides would be released. Now, we know later on that didn't happen. Some American troops were held after this. Part of the peace agreement was we would end all activity in Laos and Cambodia, and that both countries, North and South Vietnam, would continue to be divided along the 17th parallel. We were hoping it would be kind of like a Korean War thing, where, okay, at least we stopped communism from continuing to spread. That's not what ended up happening, though. After the U.S. leaves during that 60-day period, fighting starts back up. The North Vietnamese continue to try to take over South Vietnam, and they make progress over the next 2 years. On April 29th, 1975, North Vietnam captures Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. At that point, the war is over. North Vietnam wins. North Vietnam unites the country under a communist government. The U.S., we still had officials in South Vietnam, military, all different kinds of officials. We tried to have this max of getting our people out and getting out key South Vietnamese people that we know the North Vietnamese will probably kill. In the end, 58,000 Americans die, another 300,000 are wounded, millions of Vietnamese are dead. The whole domino theory, the thing that kind of brought us into the war, the reality about that is that the only countries that dominoed and became communist were countries we fought in: Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It didn't domino to any other countries in Southeast Asia. And Americans were really upset. We had fought. So many Americans had died, had been wounded. It cost us so much money. And what did we get out of it? Really kind of like our first L in a war. The soldiers really weren't treated well. I think Americans to this day go out of their way to treat soldiers well, but they were not treated well coming back from Vietnam. And that kind of had a lingering thing. And the book part that you're going to read talks about the Vietnam Memorial kind of healing some of those wounds for soldiers. So that's the end of the notes. So things to know about the war: we signed this agreement in 73, we bail out, but the war continues and North Vietnam ultimately wins. And ultimately, Americans realize probably didn't matter if Vietnam was communist or not. But during that time period in the Cold War, we just were afraid it would domino to an entire other region. Okay, thanks, guys.